Marcus Johnson's hand froze midair as the termination notice flashed across his tablet screen. 6 years of spotless service on the Celestial Voyager, one of humanity's most prestigious interstellar passenger vessels, gone in an instant. His perfect record, his recommendations, his career trajectory, all erased with a single notification. All because he had helped an old alien who couldn't breathe. The memory replayed in his mind with painful clarity. He had been patrolling Deck 7, the luxury passenger section, where wealthy tourists and important diplomats stayed during the 3-week journey between Earth and the colonies on Proxima Centauri. The corridors had been unusually crowded as passengers returned from the observation deck after viewing the famous Epsilon Nebula. That's when he'd spotted the Arcanian passenger, an elderly figure with pale blue skin and delicate gill-like structures on their neck. They were hunched over in obvious distress, thin fingers fumbling with their portable oxygen adapter. The device had malfunctioned, and in the dense crowd, no one had stopped to help. Marcus glanced at his uniform now, neatly folded in his small travel bag. The silver security badge that had once filled him with pride now seemed to mock him. Protocol violation 1329B. Unauthorized physical contact with passenger, his supervisor, Officer Trent, had said coldly after pulling Marcus into his office. The man hadn't even looked up from his screen while delivering the news. Pack your things. Your security clearance ends in 30 minutes. But the passenger was in respiratory distress. Marcus had protested, his voice rising with disbelief. I tried calling medical, but they were dealing with an emergency in the dining hall. What was I supposed to do? Just watch someone die because of company policy? Officer Trent had finally looked up then, his expression flat and uninterested. That's what the liability waiver is for. You know the rules, Johnson. No physical contact with passengers unless you're security certified for their species. Period. I am certified for basic Arcanian physiology, Marcus had countered, feeling heat rise to his face. Basic, not medical, Trent had replied with finality. Now clear out your locker before I have to call someone to escort you. Now, sitting alone in his tiny crew quarters, Marcus's fingers trembled as he placed his navy blue uniform in his bag. The Celestial Voyager had been his home for 6 years. He'd missed his sister's wedding to complete training. He'd worked double shifts during the Centauri crisis when half the crew had fallen ill. He'd received 3 commendations for going above and beyond duty. And none of it mattered now. The elderly Arcanian's face flashed in his memory, the look of panic as they struggled for breath, then the profound relief when Marcus had quickly diagnosed the issue and reset their adapter. The quiet thank you they had whispered, their 4-fingered hand briefly touching his arm in gratitude. 20 minutes later, Marcus had been called to Trent's office and fired. He looked around his small quarters one last time. The space was barely larger than a closet, with just enough room for a narrow bed, a storage compartment, and a tiny desk. Still, it had been his space. He'd kept a small plant from Earth on the shelf, a succulent his mother had given him, and a holo photo of his family back in New Lagos. They were counting on his income. What would he tell them? As Marcus placed the plant and photo in his bag, a small alert tone sounded from his tablet. He almost ignored it, assuming it was just the system acknowledging his clearance termination. But something made him glance at the screen. A new message had appeared, marked with flashing red borders. Urgente execute priority way. Marcus frowned. Executive priority messages were reserved for ship-wide emergencies or communications from the highest levels of Celestial Fleet Command. He had never received one in 6 years of service. He tapped the screen to open the message, half expecting some kind of error. Instead, precise text appeared. Report to Celestial Fleet Headquarters, Earth Tower. Tomorrow, 900 hours. Office of CEO Victoria Jong. Transportation arranged. Dock B-22. Marcus stared at the screen in disbelief, reading the message 3 times to ensure he hadn't misunderstood. Victoria Jung was the CEO of the entire Celestial Fleet Corporation, a woman whose face appeared on business magazines and news broadcasts, who controlled the largest civilian space transportation company in the solar system. And she wanted to see him, personally, tomorrow. That never happened to fired employees, ever. Especially not to black security officers from Level 3 who had no connections, no wealthy family backing, nothing but their work record to stand on. His heart began to race as possibilities flooded his mind. Was this some kind of extended punishment? A public example? Or perhaps something else entirely? Marcus sat heavily on his bed, the tablet still clutched in his hand. He had 12 hours before the last shuttle departed the Celestial Voyager for Earth. 12 hours to wonder why the most powerful woman in interstellar transportation wanted to meet with the security guard who had just been fired for helping a passenger breathe. As he finished packing his few belongings, a cold knot formed in Marcus's stomach. Whatever waited for him in that tower tomorrow, he suspected his life was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. The Celestial Fleet headquarters gleamed like a silver needle piercing the morning clouds, its polished exterior reflecting the golden sunrise across New Beijing's skyline. Marcus Johnson stood at the base of the imposing structure, feeling smaller than he ever had before. He tugged at his only good suit, purchased 3 years ago for his cousin's wedding and slightly tied around the shoulders now, and took a deep breath. The security checkpoint was surprisingly easy to pass. His name was already in the system, and the guards treated him with unexpected deference. "Floor 200, sir. Executive elevators to the right," the guard said, handing back his temporary ID badge. Floor 200, the very top of the tower, where the most powerful executives in the space industry made decisions that affected billions of lives across Earth and its colonies. Marcus stepped into the executive elevator alone. It was lined with actual wood paneling, real oak, not synthetic, and soft ambient lighting that somehow made him feel both important and completely out of place. His reflection stared back at him from the polished doors, a tall black man with close-cropped hair, nervous eyes, and a tie that he now realized was slightly crooked. He adjusted it nervously as the elevator began its smooth ascent. No numbers appeared on the display, only a simple progress bar that filled as the elevator climbed higher and higher. Marcus felt his ears pop twice during the journey. Through the glass rear wall of the elevator, he watched the city shrink beneath him, becoming a miniature model of human civilization. When the doors finally opened, he stepped into a minimalist reception area. A young woman with a sleek digital tablet approached him immediately. "Mr. Johnson, please follow me. Ms. Zhang is expecting you." They walked down a corridor with one wall made entirely of glass, revealing clouds drifting by at eye level. On the other side hung original artwork, actual paintings, not digital displays. Marcus recognized a Monet, and what he thought might be a Picasso, casual displays of wealth that made his palms sweat. The assistant stopped at an unmarked door, pressed her hand to it, and stepped aside as it silently slid open. "Good luck," she said with an enigmatic smile before walking away. Marcus stepped into a surprisingly modest office. He had expected something grand and imposing, but instead found a practical space with a simple desk, several comfortable chairs, and a large display wall currently showing a 360-degree view of Earth from orbit. CEO Victoria Jung stood looking at the display, her back to him. She was smaller than he had imagined, with her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than the elaborate style she wore in official photos. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said without turning. "I keep this view to remind myself what we're working for. Not profits, not market share, but connecting humanity across the stars while preserving our home." When she finally turned to face him, Marcus was struck by how much younger she appeared in person than in her photos and video appearances. Her face was unlined, with keen eyes that studied him with uncomfortable intensity. "Please, sit down, Mr. Johnson," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk as she took her own seat. No greeting, no small talk. Marcus sat stiffly, hands resting on his knees. "Do you know who you helped yesterday, Mr. Johnson?" she asked directly. "An elderly Arcanian passenger having breathing difficulties, ma'am," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Zhang held his gaze for a moment, then pressed a button on her desk. The orbital view disappeared, replaced by a hologram that materialized in the center of the room. It showed the alien Marcus had assisted, the delicate blue skin, the gill-like structures now clearly visible, the four-fingered hands, and the distinctive cranial ridges that marked high-status Arcanians. "This is Ambassador Thexla," Zhang said, her voice taking on a reverent quality. "The first Arcanian diplomat to ever officially visit Earth. Their species has technology centuries beyond ours, including atmospheric restoration systems that could reverse our climate crisis in less than a decade." Marcus stared at the hologram, his mouth suddenly dry. "I didn't know." "Few people do," John replied. "The Arcanians are extremely selective about who they interact with. They've refused formal contact with 17 other spacefaring species in our galactic neighborhood. We've been trying to establish diplomatic relations for over 40 years. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "What you don't know, Mr. Johnson, is that the Arcanians believe character reveals itself in unguarded moments. They've been secretly watching humanity for decades, judging if we're worthy partners. Their ships are virtually undetectable to our technology. They observe how we treat each other, how we treat other species, how we handle crisis." Marcus felt a wave of dizziness wash over him as the implications became clear. "And I was being tested?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, that's the point." Zhang's face softened for the first time, the hint of a genuine smile touching her lips. "You weren't performing. You weren't following a diplomatic protocol. You just helped someone in need, even knowing it would cost your job. The ambassador was deeply impressed by your genuine compassion." Marcus looked down at his hands, trying to process what he was hearing. Yesterday he had been fired in disgrace. Today he was sitting in the CEO's office being told he had somehow impressed one of the most advanced alien species known to humanity. "I don't understand," he finally said. "If they value compassion, why would your company have a policy that prevents us from helping passengers?" Zhang sighed. "Corporate liability concerns overriding human decency. The policy was implemented after several lawsuits from passengers claiming injury from well-intentioned crew members. I've been trying to change it, but bureaucracy moves slowly." She gave him an appraising look. "Sometimes it takes someone willing to break the rules to remind us why the rules exist in the first place." Marcus straightened in his chair as a new thought occurred to him. "So I'm not fired?" Zhang's smile widened. "On the contrary, Mr. Johnson, the Arcanians have requested you specifically for something much bigger." She pressed another button, and the hologram changed to show a sleek spacecraft unlike any human vessel Marcus had ever seen. "How would you feel about making history?" she asked. "May." Marcus stared at the holographic star map showing the journey to the Arcanian homeworld. The three-dimensional display filled the center of Zhang's office, stars and planets rotating slowly in blue light. A red line traced the proposed route, longer than any human had ever traveled before. "I'm just a security officer. I don't know anything about diplomacy." The distance made his stomach tighten. The journey would take them beyond even the furthest human colonies, into a section of space that, until recently, most scientists had believed was uninhabited. "That's exactly why they want you," Zhang explained, walking around the hologram to stand beside him. She pointed to a bright blue sphere rotating at the end of the red path. "The Arcanians distrust professional diplomats. They've observed how our politicians and designated representatives often say one thing while thinking another. They believe true character shows in ordinary people making difficult choices." Marcus ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, still struggling to process everything. "But what about my family? My sister in New Lagos? I can't just disappear without telling them anything." They'll be informed that you've been selected for a special assignment, Zhang said, and compensated generously for your absence. I've already arranged everything. 3 days later, Marcus found himself aboard the Celestial Emissary, humanity's newest and most advanced diplomatic vessel. His personal quarters were larger than his entire apartment on Earth. The ship had been rushed into service specifically for this mission, its maiden voyage more important than anyone outside a small circle realized. His rushed training in Arcanian customs left his head spinning. Every morning from 600 to 1200, cultural specialists drilled him on proper greetings, eating etiquette, and conversation taboos. The afternoons were filled with language training, not to speak the complex Arcanian dialect, which human vocal cords couldn't fully reproduce, but to recognize basic phrases and intentions. Never show the palms of your hands directly to an Arcanian elder, his etiquette instructor warned. It's considered an aggressive challenge. Their number system is based on 8, not 10, his mathematics tutor explained. Always convert your thinking before discussing quantities. They don't blink like we do, the xenobiologist told him. Don't be unsettled by their continuous gaze, and whatever you do, never mimic their breathing sounds. At night, Marcus would collapse into his bed, mind racing with information. He kept asking himself the same question. Why me? Out of all the people on Earth, why had they chosen a mid-level security officer with no diplomatic training or special skills? 1 week into the journey, as the Earth shrank to a mere blue dot in the view screens, CEO Zhang requested Marcus's presence in her private quarters on the ship. He hadn't seen much of her since boarding, as she had been occupied with the official diplomatic team. A group of 12 highly trained professionals who barely acknowledged Marcus's existence. Zhang's quarters were Spartan, with none of the luxury one might expect from the most powerful corporate leader in the solar system. She motioned for him to sit at a small table where a tea set waited. We're far enough from Earth now, she said, pouring 2 cups of steaming green tea. She pressed a small device on her wrist, and a quiet hum filled the room. Privacy field, she explained. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. Marcus nodded, taking the offered tea. There are powerful people who don't want this alliance to succeed, she whispered, leaning forward. Earth's biggest corporations make trillions from managing our environmental crisis, not solving it. The atmospheric scrubber industry alone is worth 9 trillion credits annually. The flood barrier conglomerates, the artificial crop developers, the carbon sequestration firms, they all profit immensely from Earth's ongoing environmental struggles. Marcus set his cup down, and Arcanian technology would make those industries obsolete. Exactly, Zhang nodded. If we gain access to their atmospheric restoration systems, their drought-resistant agriculture methods, their clean energy technology, many of Earth's richest and most influential people would lose everything. The realization settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders. So why send me at all? Why not just cancel the mission? Because the Arcanians requested you by name. To refuse would end any chance of an alliance. She took a sip of her tea, her eyes never leaving his. And because I believe some things are more important than corporate profits. Earth is dying, Marcus. We've slowed the process, but we haven't reversed it. The Arcanians might be our last, best hope. Does the rest of the diplomatic team know this? Some do. Others are simply doing their jobs. But I suspect at least 1 or 2 may have divided loyalties. As Marcus returned to his quarters that night, the weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. He wasn't just representing humanity. He was potentially carrying the future of Earth itself on his shoulders. The next morning, he began paying closer attention to the other members of the diplomatic team. Most seemed genuine in their preparation, studying Arcanian culture with dedication. But one man, Communications Officer Rayburn, seemed oddly detached from the mission's importance. As the ship prepared for its first faster-than-light jump, Marcus was heading to the observation deck when he passed a small communications alcove. Inside, Rayburn was hunched over a console, his fingers moving quickly across the surface. Marcus paused, something about the man's furtive movements triggering his security training. Rayburn was sending a message, not through the ship's official channels, but through what appeared to be a private device connected to the ship's subspace array. As Marcus watched from the shadows, he caught a glimpse of the transmission. It was encrypted, but the routing address briefly flashed on the screen. Terran Environmental Preservation Corporation, one of the largest atmospheric scrubber manufacturers on Earth. Marcus felt his blood run cold. Zhang's warnings hadn't been paranoia. The sabotage had already begun. He backed away quietly, mind racing. Should he confront Rayburn directly? Report to Zhang. Try to intercept future messages. Whatever he decided, Marcus realized that his mission had just become far more complicated than helping an alien with a breathing device. The fate of two worlds now hung in the balance, and he was caught in the middle. The Arcanian homeworld glowed like a blue jewel against the blackness of space, its atmosphere shimmering with iridescent clouds unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. After 3 weeks of faster-than-light travel, the celestial emissary had finally reached its destination. Marcus stood at the main observation window, his breath fogging the glass as their ship began its descent. Beautiful, isn't it? Zhang appeared beside him, her usual composed demeanor softened by genuine wonder. Marcus could only nod. Below them, crystal cities stretched across vast plains, their structures catching and refracting sunlight in rainbow patterns. Unlike human cities with their straight lines and rigid grids, Arcanian architecture flowed in organic curves, buildings growing from the landscape like living things. Those aren't buildings, the xenobiologist Dr. Chen said, joining them at the window. At least, not as we understand them. The Arcanians grow their structures from living crystal that responds to their needs. Some of those cities are over 10,000 years old. Marcus tried to comprehend such longevity. Earth's oldest surviving structures were barely 5,000 years old, and most modern buildings were designed to last a century at most. The ship's descent continued, bringing them closer to a massive structure at the center of the largest city, a spiraling tower that rose above everything else, its peak disappearing into the clouds. The Hall of Communion, Zhang explained. Their central governing complex, and where the welcoming ceremony will take place. Marcus felt his stomach knot with anxiety. Despite weeks of preparation, he still didn't understand why he was here. The diplomatic team had made it clear they considered him an unwelcome addition, especially Rayburn, who had barely hidden his contempt. The landing was smoother than any Marcus had experienced on Earth. As the ship settled onto a crystalline platform, he could see a delegation of Arcanians waiting. Tall, slender figures with their distinctive blue skin shimmering in the sunlight. Remember your training, Zhang whispered as the airlock cycled. And remember why you're here. Just be yourself. The welcoming ceremony began formally enough. The human delegation, led by Ambassador Chen, followed precise protocols, exchanging practiced greetings with the Arcanian officials. Marcus stood at the back of the group, trying to remain inconspicuous. Then Ambassador Thexla stepped forward. Marcus immediately recognized the elderly Arcanian he had helped on the ship. Thexla began a formal speech, but suddenly paused mid-sentence. The ambassador's gill structures fluttered rapidly, and without warning, Thexla collapsed to the crystal floor. The human diplomats froze, uncertain how to respond. Marcus heard Rayburn whisper urgently, "Don't touch them. Remember protocol." But Marcus was already moving. Without hesitation, he pushed through the diplomatic team and knelt beside the fallen ambassador. He recognized the symptoms immediately. The same breathing difficulty he had witnessed on the ship. With careful movements, he located the small adapter at Thexla's throat and made a minor adjustment, just as he had done before. The effect was immediate. Thexla's breathing stabilized, and the ambassador's eyes, large, multifaceted orbs of deep indigo, focused on Marcus. "You moved without calculation," Thexla said in a voice that seemed to resonate directly in Marcus's mind. "This is most satisfactory." Later, in private quarters assigned to the human delegation, Zhang confronted Marcus. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," she said, though her expression held more admiration than anger. "I just did what anyone would do," Marcus replied. "No," Zhang shook her head. "The others didn't move. Only you. You move with your heart first," Vexilla said when visiting Marcus that evening. The ambassador had fully recovered and seemed energized. "This is what we hope to find in humans. Your species is young, but your capacity for immediate compassion, this is rare among the stars." Over the next days, Marcus faced increasingly difficult trials that tested not just compassion but judgment. The Arcanians took him away from the main diplomatic team for what they called truth exchanges. Each morning, he would be led to a different location, sometimes a crystal garden, other times a subterranean chamber filled with bioluminescent life forms. There, he would face scenarios designed to probe his ethical framework. 2 vessels are failing. One carries 100 of your kind. One carries a single Arcanian elder with unique knowledge. You can save only one. Which do you choose? An Arcanian elder asked him. "A disease threatens your world. The cure requires resources that would take a century to replace. Do you save your generation at the cost of your grandchildren's future?" Another questioned. Each time, Marcus answered honestly, often struggling with the impossible choices. Sometimes, he could tell his answers disappointed the Arcanians. Other times, they seemed pleased, but they never told him if he was right or wrong. Meanwhile, he became aware that someone was working against him. Key information would be missing from his briefings. Directions to meeting locations would be incorrect, making him late. Once, he found his translator device reprogrammed to mistranslate critical terms. Marcus suspected Rayburn, but had no proof. The communications officer was always perfectly professional in public, especially around Zhang. On the 7th day, Marcus was brought to a chamber deep within the Hall of Communion. The room was circular, with walls of living crystal that pulsed with soft blue light. Ambassador Vexilla waited alone. "You have impressed many of our elders," Vexilla said without preamble. "It is time for you to understand why you are truly here." The ambassador touched the wall, and a crystal responded, forming images of Arcanian children. But unlike the adults Marcus had met, these children showed concerning symptoms: weakened gill structures, dulled skin tones, fragile limbs. "Our genetic diversity is failing," Vexilla explained, voice heavy with sorrow. "An ancient war reduced our population to a fraction of its former size. We have tried to recover, but without new genetic material compatible with our own, my people will be extinct within 3 generations." Marcus stared at the images, understanding dawning. "The technology you offered Earth is real, and we will share it freely. But we hope to find more than a trading partner. We need genetic compatibility to save our species. Our scientists believe humans and Arcanians share a distant ancestor, a cosmic gardener race that seeded many worlds millions of years ago." Marcus understood the true exchange being offered. Earth would receive technology to heal its environment, while the Arcanians would receive the genetic diversity needed for their survival. That night, unable to sleep, Marcus decided to check the lab where human genetic samples were being prepared for Arcanian scientists. As he approached the dimly lit room, he noticed the door slightly ajar. Inside, a figure hunched over the storage units. Rayburn, the communications officer, was replacing vials of human genetic material with others from a case he carried. "What are you doing?" Marcus demanded, stepping into the room. Rayburn spun around, surprised, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small weapon. "You don't understand what's at stake," he snarled. Marcus stood before the combined council of Earth and Arcania, his left shoulder still bandaged beneath his formal diplomatic attire. The wound throbbed occasionally, a physical reminder of his struggle with Rayburn 3 days earlier. The chamber was unlike anything he had ever seen. A vast circular room with walls of living crystal that seemed to breathe with the collective emotions of those gathered inside. 200 human representatives sat on one side, government officials, corporate leaders, and scientific experts who had arrived on emergency transports after the incident. Across from them sat the Arcanian High Council, their blue skin and elaborate ceremonial attire glittering under the chamber's bioluminescent lighting. Marcus glanced at the empty seat where Rayburn should have been. After their confrontation in the lab, the man was now confined to the Celestial Emissary's brig. The genetic samples he had attempted to sabotage, deliberately contaminated to create incompatibility between human and Arcanian DNA, had been secured and replaced with viable specimens. The human wishes to address the combined council, Ambassador Thexla announced, voice resonating through the chamber without any visible amplification technology. Marcus took a deep breath. He had never spoken to a group larger than his security team back on the Celestial Voyager. Now, the fate of 2 species might hang on his words. Zhang had offered to help prepare a speech, but Marcus had declined. He needed to speak from the heart. "Our people stand at a crossroads," he said simply, his voice steady despite his nerves. "We can choose fear and isolation, or compassion and cooperation. I'm just a security officer, but I've seen how a single act of kindness can change everything." He paused, looking at both sides of the chamber. The man who tried to sabotage our alliance wasn't evil. He was afraid. Afraid that helping the Arcanians would somehow diminish humanity. Afraid that change means loss. Marcus touched his wounded shoulder gently. "When Ambassador Thexla couldn't breathe on our ship, I didn't stop to calculate the risks or benefits of helping. I just helped, because that's what living beings do for each other. And now I understand that's what makes us compatible with the Arcanians, not just our DNA, but our capacity for compassion." He turned to face the human delegation directly. "The technology the Arcanians are offering will save our planet. Their atmospheric restoration systems alone will reverse centuries of damage within decades. Their agricultural methods will end food insecurity. Their medical knowledge will extend human lifespans. And yes, our genetic diversity will help save their species from extinction." Marcus looked at each face in the human delegation, lingering on the corporate representatives who had the most to lose financially. "Some of you fear this alliance will destroy industries worth trillions. You're right, but it will create new ones worth even more. Adaptation has always been humanity's greatest strength." He turned back to the Arcanians. "And you feared humans might be too primitive, too self-interested to be worthy partners. Sometimes we are. But at our best, we're capable of tremendous compassion and sacrifice for others, even those who look nothing like us." The chamber fell silent as Marcus finished speaking. For a moment, he feared he had failed, that his simple words weren't enough to bridge the gap between 2 vastly different species. Then an elderly Arcanian rose from the High Council. "I have lived 12 of your centuries." The elder's voice resonated. "In that time, 17 species have reached for the stars. Only yours has reached with an open hand rather than a closed fist." The council chamber erupted in applause, a strange mixture of human clapping and the Arcanian equivalent, a harmonic humming that made the crystal walls vibrate in sympathy. At the center of the chamber, the leaders of both delegations met to sign the historic alliance document. As Marcus watched, Ambassador Thexla approached him. "You have done what our scientists thought impossible. You have built a bridge between stars." "I just helped someone who couldn't breathe," Marcus said with a small smile. "And in doing so, helped both our species breathe easier," Thexla replied, placing a 4-fingered hand gently on Marcus's uninjured shoulder. "The council has voted. We request that you remain as the human ambassador to our world." 1 month later, Marcus stood on a stage at Celestial Fleet headquarters on Earth. Behind him, the Manhattan skyline was barely visible through the environmental haze that had grown worse during his absence. But soon, Arcanian atmospheric processors would begin the healing process. CEO Zhang approached the podium, her face broadcast on screens worldwide. "Today, Celestial Fleet unveils a new company policy that will apply to all our vessels, stations, and facilities throughout human space. We call it the Johnson Protocol. The crowd murmured as Marcus's name appeared on the massive screen behind Zhang. From this day forward, Zhang announced, her voice firm with conviction, compassion takes precedence over procedure when lives are at stake. No employee will ever again be punished for helping another being in distress, regardless of species, status, or circumstance. She turned to Marcus, genuine respect in her eyes. A single act of kindness transformed our future. We would do well to make such acts the foundation of our society, not the exception. After the ceremony, Marcus stood alone at the observation deck, looking out at the polluted sky. Tomorrow, he would return to the Arcanian homeworld to begin his new role as human ambassador to the Galactic Concord, the interspecies alliance that was already expanding to include 3 other spacefaring civilizations. He thought about how different his life had become since that moment when he chose to help a struggling passenger. 1 month ago, he had been a mid-level security officer facing unemployment. Now, he represented humanity to the stars. A young Celestial Fleet cadet approached him hesitantly. Ambassador Johnson, they told me you were up here. Your shuttle is ready for departure. Marcus nodded, taking one last look at the Earth he was helping to save. Thank you, he said, following the cadet toward the elevator. As they walked, the cadet asked, is it true what they say? That you broke company policy to help the Arcanian? Marcus smiled. Sometimes breaking the rules is the most human thing you can do. The cadet considered this, then straightened with newfound determination. I'll remember that, sir. Don't just remember it, Marcus said gently. Live it. The universe is watching how we treat each other. Every act of kindness echoes across the stars. As his shuttle lifted off the next morning, Marcus watched Earth grow smaller beneath him. The planet looked fragile from space, a delicate blue sphere suspended in darkness. But now, for the first time in centuries, its future held more promise than peril. All because he had stopped to help someone who couldn't breathe.